Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. I can remember the first time I appeared on the show. It was June 2018, and my predecessor, Pamela Paul, the former editor of the Book Review, had invited me on to talk about the author Stephen King. My co-expert for that segment was Victor LaValle, who had just reviewed King's novel The Outsider for the Book Review. The Outsider, if you haven't read it, it's a very good horror crime novel, and Victor's review is in part an ode to Stephen King, who's one of the prime influences in his writing life. The two of us spent a few minutes on that episode talking about our favorite books of his. Cut to a few years later. Now, I'm the editor of the Book Review. I'm the host of the show, and Victor is back.
I'm back.
He's back. He's here with me this week to talk about his fantastic novel, Lone Women. For those of you who haven't had the chance to immerse yourself in the work of Victor LaValle, he has released 4 books over the past 15 years or so: Big Machine, The Devil in Silver, The Ballad of Black Tom, and The Changeling, that demonstrate an incredible ability to balance genre and tone, particularly horror, with other modes of writing. His new work, Lone Women, is definitely horror, but it's also a Western. It's historical fiction of sorts. It's a lot of things. He's going to tell us about it. I'm excited to talk to you about it, Victor. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So your book is called Lone Women, but it starts with a lone woman, singular. Tell us about her.
So the book begins with Adelaide Henry, who is a black woman farmer in California in 1915. And at the start of the book, she's setting fire to her family home. And inside her family home, both her parents are dead. And all she leaves with is a giant steamer trunk that's been locked with a padlock. And she travels all the way from Southern California up to Montana, where she hopes to stake a claim and perhaps start again.
That's a good summary. That's a good summary. But so much of this book is about the setting, 1915 Montana. It has to do a lot of work, that setting. You grew up in New York, just like me. Had you ever been to Montana before?
I drove through Montana and fell in love with Montana. It's more than 15 years ago. I was a visiting professor at Mills College in Oakland, California. My 2-year gig was up, and while I was there, I'd bought my first car ever, and I didn't want to give it up. But it wasn't a great car, didn't have air conditioning that worked reliably. So driving it back to New York, I had 2 choices. I could drive south through the heat of the summer, or I could drive north, and I chose north. And so I drove across the top of the country and drove right through Montana, Glacier National Park, Crater Lake. I just fell in love with it. And maybe even more, or just as much, I fell in love with the little ghost towns I was passing by as I drove, and they never left me.
What were your impressions at the time as someone who had lived in a big city, who was currently leaving a city, Oakland, San Francisco? So much of what this book is about is the solitude, the emptiness, the wind.
That wind. Well, it was beautiful, number one. I mean, I feel like I can never take that away. But also, it's true, as a kid who grew up in New York, in Queens, it was also terrifying because I realized if you're alone out here, you are alone.
Adelaide Henry, the protagonist of your book, she goes to Montana partially to escape the incident that opens the book, but also to try to make another life as a homesteader. Her and her parents in California were farmers. They were homesteaders themselves. Tell us a little bit about that history, what it meant to be a homesteader.
The federal government was expanding the nation, trying to, for lack of better terms, colonize the nation. The army had gone to war with the indigenous population and had largely moved them off great pockets of land, and then wanted American citizens to come in and cultivate that land, live on that land, take that land over. They were so desperate to have that happen that they loosened a lot of the guidelines, the structures that we probably assume would be in place. Like my own assumption before I started doing the research was that only white men would be allowed, and maybe white women could be there. But even that I wasn't sure. And in fact, what I discovered was that they relaxed the laws so that single women and widows could come to the land. And they also relaxed at least some of the racial lines. So a black woman like Adelaide could indeed claim land. But at the same time, Chinese Americans were the largest quote-unquote minority population at the time in Montana, and they couldn't claim land because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that had gone into effect a few decades earlier as a response to the growing Chinese population and its relative success.
I don't want to ruin anything about this book, All we can say is Adelaide is carrying the steamer trunk, and she doesn't want it to be open. And if it does get open,
bad things happen.
Bad things happen.
Yes.
Bad things happen. It's a great setup. But as a book that straddles horror and Western, two genres that have their own archetypes, you tried to sort of balance those two in your mind.
Well, the thing that I most tried to do was ground it in real history. Because at least for me, the horror that I love the most is the kind that sort of takes things that really could have happened and just slightly turns the dial a little higher. And the reason for that is not simply just to have fun with monsters or with ghosts or whatever it might be, but because sometimes explaining what happened is not the same as making someone understand how it felt to go through what happened. And so monsters or horror or whatever we want to call something, unnatural, supernatural, can really help to make a reader feel what that experience was like. And that's when I launched up from historical fiction or Western fiction into something more gothic, something more surprising and strange. But it was always with the idea of saying, how do I really make the reader understand the level of terror, isolation, desperation that a person might be feeling? You can only use those terms so often before maybe sometimes you need to give it a more visceral explanation.
I want to return to this in a minute, but before we leave the question of historical fact, I am curious about how you conducted the research that went into this book.
Well, it all began totally by chance in the local history section at the University of Montana bookstore where I was for a reading. I came across an amazing book called Montana Women Homesteaders, A Field of One's Own by Dr. Sarah Carter. And I picked it up off the shelf entirely just because I'd never heard of lone women homesteaders. The more I read the book, the more fascinated I became with these women. And after finishing her book, I started diving into all these other books about African Americans in the West, about women homesteaders and their diaries. And the more I read, the more absolutely fascinating this period of time and these people became.
I know because of conversations we've had in the past that you are extremely familiar with sort of the touchstones of horror fiction. Did you feel like you needed to dip into Western fiction in any way before setting out on the journey of writing this book?
Well, certainly there was like the Cormac McCarthy kind of writing, which is more southern West, but certainly has that feeling of like the mythic and the grand. But I also got into writers like Joan Didion and Wallace Stegner, even though that's California, the feeling of sort of like the grand but also spare nature of the prose. So it was less about reading, say, like the old Western writers. Well, they were Western writers, but not writing Westerns, if that makes sense. And then also, if I'm honest, I also was very steeped in my uncle used to make me watch John Wayne films with him when I was a kid. And so I felt like that was another kind of well that I was dipping into, in part for what I might do, but also what I might not do.
What was something that you realized with your main character, Adelaide Henry, partway through the book that you didn't think was going to happen when you started? How did she change over the writing of the book, if she did?
I feel like I really came to know her when I started to associate her with my mother and my grandmother. So my mother is an immigrant from Uganda. She came first to Canada, actually, and she fled Canada because Canada was too racist, and she came to New York, to the U.S. And for better or worse, this is where she decided to stay. But that was her path. And as I was working on the book, I started to make this sort of comparison, the way that Adelaide is going up to Montana alone as a Black woman and trying to make her place there in Montana. I started thinking about my mother as a Black woman coming from Uganda alone, going to Canada first and getting this very chilly welcome there, which is always a surprise to folks, and then coming to the U.S. and finding, for better or worse, more of a home. And I started to think about her bravery being much like Adelaide's bravery. And in that way, where before Adelaide was a character, I started to imbue her with greater degrees of love and admiration. And it was what I was taking from my feelings for my mom.
One of the joys of the book is as you just alluded to, the community of sorts that Adelaide finds in Montana, which is a bunch of lone women.
Yes.
What was it like coming up with that group of women? They're all so unique in their own way. They all have their own histories, but there's a queer couple, one Chinese or
Chinese American,
Chinese American, and an African American. There's a woman who has her child out there alone in the grand expanse of Montana. And by the end of the novel, they really are this community of a sort. How did you conceive of coming up with a group of women that each, in my mind at least, represented something different about what it meant to be out there alone?
Well, I certainly, number one, based them again on types of people that I found existed for real there. One of the rules I had was like, there's only one, let's say, impossible thing, and then everything else is, you can find historical data to prove that this could have happened, that could have happened, this person could have been there, and so forth. But at heart, two things really inspired that. The first book itself, the Montana Women Homesteaders book, one of the things that came up as a regular refrain was how much the lone women became friends with each other, how much they bonded with one another because, again, they were alone. Lots of other people came with families, and therefore that was their unit. Or men came alone, and either they lived in total isolation, and that seemed fine with them, or they bonded with other men, but these women were not going to bond with them. And so I knew that was one of the precedents. They did find community. But the other thing that inspired it was my wife and her friendships with women, and me observing the ways that she has this very healthy circle of women, each of whom serves a different purpose in her life, and she serves a different purpose in theirs. They meet up for coffee, they speak on the phone, they email. Every once in a while they go out to dinner. And I was thinking about, I got one best friend and he lives in Portland. You know what I mean? And I really admired the love and care that those women give to my wife and my wife gives to them. And I just wanted to write about that because I just thought it was beautiful.
Horror as a genre can be many things. It can be like Baroque or really focused on the body, like Clive Barker. It can be extraordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, like Stephen King. The whole thing could be a metaphor. It could be all mood. You know, when you, as you've really leaned into over the past many years working this genre more, how have you tried to carve out your space in it?
So my editor for every single one of my books except my first one is a wonderful editor named Chris Jackson at One World. And a few books into this process, when I started writing into the genre elements that I love, he said he realized at a certain point that my theme again and again and again is the secret hero. In the end, that's always what I'm writing about. And he's right. One of the main elements for that is that you have to write about people who are overlooked, people who are usually the cannon fodder, and then somehow or another, they prove to be the ones with the mettle to survive, to do well, to triumph, whatever it might be. And so for me, I think regardless of if it's deeply historically researched like this, or if it's something that might be a little bit wilder, like my novel Big Machine, in the end, what I'm always playing with is this question of who is the overlooked person and how can they prove that they deserved better than they got. And my feeling being that I'm guessing a lot of people feel that way.
Horror has a very clear history when it comes to racial minorities and minorities of other sorts. I saw you did a By the Book for us, and you said on your nightstand, I don't know if you've started it yet, is a book called The Black Guy Dies First, which I actually saw on a bookstore table last week. And I know that book is about, in part at least, the history of Black people in horror movies, where we all know the trope, which is like, oh, it's 1993 and Ice Cube is in this movie. He's definitely going to die.
Until he became famous.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. Have you started that book? I
haven't started it yet, but it's the thing I'm relishing, just because it is such a cliche of the genre that now even horror movies now understand it. And sometimes that means they let the Black character lives to the end, but more often it means they kill off one white person first, and then they kill off the Black character. So the sequel will be The Black Guy Dies Second.
That's progress.
Yes, that's progress.
I know a few years ago you worked on a graphic novel, sort of modern day version, correct me if I'm wrong, of a Frankenstein.
Yes, it's called Destroyer.
You talk about the secret hero, and I know that you are someone who includes in their list of influences comic books as a genre, as a storytelling format, as a storytelling medium. What things have you picked up from that form of storytelling that you find applies to your fiction writing?
I love that comic books dream as big as possible. They dream bigger than film and TV, certainly, and often even bigger than fiction, because I think for a great deal of fiction, or the fiction I read, the impulse, the knee-jerk impulse, if you want to get big, you get big on the inside. You have tons of internal monologue, and you spend a great deal of backstory, and you learn all the rest like that. Whereas I really love comics kind of say like, well, how could we make that visual and literal? And then you might have a comic book with a character who wakes up one day and then they have every one of their ancestors trailing behind them everywhere they go. And they have to figure out, how do you get through like a sliding glass door when you have 15 generations of humans behind you? And I just love the playfulness of that, the grand scope of such an image. And so there are ways that I've been trying to steal that visual bravery in particular and put it into fiction and figure out how to do it without making it silly.
You started your career in a more, quote, literary mode.
Yes.
Or what is
literary realism.
Literary realism. And you've moved away from that a little bit. How crazy do you want to get in your career when it comes to taking some of those things from comic books or other genres? Because I imagine it's hard to pull away maybe from what you thought was the respectable thing to do early in your career and move into this other space that I think we both know is more respected by the day, but still has a little tinge about it.
Oh, more than a little, yeah, for sure. I mean, that divide, I think, between the genre elements remains. The usual way that you manage it is that whatever the metaphor is so clear that people who hate anything fantastical can go, oh no, that's okay. The monster is just the civil rights movement or something like that. And they can rest easy, right? It's more like when the strange things don't have a clear and simple one-for-one, that things start to get a little touchy. So my first two books were literary realism, and then my third, Big Machine, was the beginning of me writing into genre, speculative, whatever we want to call it. And my editor and I had some back and forth about that, because I love my editor, but he hates fantastical stuff. He hates horror. He hates all that stuff. And we had a real knockdown, drag-out fight about it, because his point was, what is this for? What are you doing this for? Where will this lead? Or these were very fair questions. And I was beginning a career as a literary realist that was at the very least getting some respect. And my point to him was, but it was making me really unhappy. Like I wasn't enjoying writing. Contrary to some writers, I do enjoy writing when I'm doing the thing I like. And so the risk seemed worth it to be able to say, tomorrow I'm excited to sit down and write, as opposed to tomorrow I wonder if I will get that Guggenheim. You know what I mean? It just didn't seem worth it after a certain point. And I got that Guggenheim.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel like that's the punchline of that. And I got it after. I mean, but that's really, in a way, my point is like, there was the fear about what do I do if I start to incorporate that stuff. But in a strange and surprising way, I still enjoyed at least some of that. We see what you're doing and we respect what you're doing. And so I felt very lucky.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm here with Victor LaValle, author of Lone Women. We're going to shift now to talk about influences, specifically about the book that Victor has read the most over the course of his life. That book is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Alongside Henry James's The Turn of the Screw and Stephen King's The Shining, The Haunting of Hill House, published in 1959, is one of the seminal haunted house stories of the 20th century. It tells a tale of Eleanor Vance, a 32-year-old woman who is invited to the titular Hill House by a psychic investigator who has gathered a small group of people to try to gather actual proof of the existence of paranormal phenomena. Eleanor, who had spent years essentially cut off from the world as she cared for her now-deceased mother, previously experienced an unexplained event when she was 12, when stones fell on her house for 3 days. This quartet of people, Eleanor, Dr. Montague, a woman named Theo, who is clairvoyant, and Luke, who's the heir to the house, experience increasingly creepy incidents as they begin to wonder what's real and what's not, as we begin to wonder what's real and what's not, and whether or not one of them is actually responsible. Victor, I'd love it if you can read the first paragraph of The Haunting of Hill House.
I'm happy to. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone.
Yeah.
I love that. One of the great opening paragraphs.
Talk to me about that paragraph.
It's such a, number one, it's just so beautifully written. I think one of the great things about Shirley Jackson is the way that she finds a way to, she writes about the fantastical, the supernatural, and all the rest, but she does it with such beautiful sentences. And it's a real gift, number one. But it's that opening line in that paragraph that is really like the organizing principle of the entire book. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. And that turns out to be essentially the test that is put to our main character, Eleanor. We see her because she's our real main character. We spend a great deal of time in her head as she's trying to parse out like what's actually happening and what isn't happening. But even more, what do I feel? What do I want? What do I not want? Do I really understand myself or not? And it's a kind of debate she's having with herself throughout the book. And by the end, I would say the choice she makes, I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but the choice she makes is almost her final reaction to the absolute reality of who she is and what her circumstances are. And it's right there in the opening sentence.
And that paragraph is repeated at the end of the book, as I recall.
That's right. And I think it's just like a refrain that comes back, but by the end of the book, hopefully you understand it very differently because of the choice that Eleanor has made. And it's spooky in the beginning, and at the end it's heartbreaking.
Talk to me about the first time you read this book, or the earliest memory that you have of reading this book, and tell me everything. Where you got it? Did you buy it? Was it at the library? Do you still have that copy? What you thought then? The whole Megillah.
Well, it actually begins before Shirley Jackson. It begins with Stephen King and his book, Danse Macabre, which was his 80s summary of the horror field in general. And as a kid who was in love with Stephen King at the time, but who was not supremely well read, I treated that book like, as many people did, I'm sure, like just a list, a bibliography. Here's everything you got to read. And for better or worse, Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House was one of the first I picked up. Actually, I know the reason is because it was one of the few that was in the library, our local, the Flushing branch of the public library. And I picked it up because Stephen King said I should. And then I read it and I didn't understand more than half of it. The funny thing is when I think about the book at my different stages, when I read it as a kid, I was probably 15. And all I really remembered, the part that really stayed with me was the haunted house. Everything's spooky, which as I reread it again, like preparing to come today, I was like looking through it and I was marveling at the fact that we don't even get to the house till page 25 of the book. And it's a short book. It's only 175 pages. But when I was a kid, that was the part that sparked my excitement. Oh, there's a big spooky house. And then the other thing that she does that to me is even more rarefied within the haunted house field, although certainly anyone who's read The Shining will understand it, is that a lot of haunted house stories turn out to be that there's an entity there that is the cause. Someone died there, a crime was done, blah, blah, blah. But in her book, it's the house itself. It's Hill House that is evil, or at least that's what Eleanor believes. The Overlook Hotel feels very much like akin to that.
Yeah, I believe there's a line early on, maybe when Eleanor sees the house for the first time. Jackson writes, "The house was vile. She shivered and thought," the words coming freely into her mind, "Hill House is vile. It is diseased. Get away from here at once." I mean, you're absolutely right that there is something to the house being evil, and the way that Jackson gets at it, as I recall, is not just having Eleanor tell us, but it's also within the architecture of the house. To me, is one of the more memorable things about the book. If you think about books that came decades later, like House of Leaves, which is about a house that keeps mutating, growing bigger on the inside. the way that Jackson describes the way rooms just don't seem right. Walls don't come together at the right angles. Pieces of the house that you should be able to see from this window are just completely obscured. It touches on how H.P. Lovecraft used to write about the way in which angles never came together in the right way, but she applies that to a house as a living organism almost.
Yeah, the non-Euclidean geometry. That was Lovecraft's whole cities built on non-Euclidean geometry, which I always love because I had no idea what that means.
I don't know what it means
Nobody
either.
knows. Nobody knows what it means. But it sounds good. And definitely Shirley Jackson, even the first time Eleanor enters her room, she's just standing at like the doorway and she's just trying to understand where the corners are because there's strange shadows in places where she thinks there shouldn't be, and the ceiling goes higher on one end than the other, and then she walks across the room and suddenly where she was looks strange. And it's so disorienting in a way that feels not cheap. I feel like the cheap version of this is she walks in and then there was a skeleton in the corner and whatever it might be.
Please, I would never read that book.
Right. It would not become a classic. But for her, it's that sense of something is off. Something is always off in this place. And then, of course, the beauty of it is you start to understand, or you start to wonder, is that the house or is that Eleanor? Because Eleanor is also always trying to figure out why can't she get close to people? Why can't she trust anyone? Why can't she love anyone? What are the things that are off in her? And how is this house a reflection of that? And it becomes this wonderful funhouse mirror back and forth between the two.
Talk to me about another moment in your life when you were older when you can remember reading this book and how you received it differently. So if the first time you read it, you're like, wow, this is a great, creepy, haunted house story. Tell me where you were in your life when you read it second, third, fourth time and what you picked up then.
So the second time I can recall reading it, it must have been about 1990, I want to say 94. And I had been kicked out of college because I was not doing well. I had poor grades, all this kind of rest. I was living in Ithaca, New York, and I took a job working for Manpower, the temp agency. And I was usually moving furniture, cleaning offices, whatever it might be, and trying to figure out was my college career over, because I got booted out in my junior year, I think. And I had a lot of free time, as you sometimes do at temp jobs. And I'd picked up the book for a class that I characteristically at that time in my life did no work in. But I had the book in the house that I was sharing, in the room that I was sharing with these other guys. And I started to read it. And the thing that stayed with me this time was those first 25 pages where you discover how awful Eleanor's life was before she shows up at Hill House. The awfulness of that was she spent years taking care of a mother who was vile to her. And then she lives with her in one of the most effective scenes right at the start, but that I totally glossed over at 15. She's sitting with her sister and brother-in-law, and she's saying, I'd like to take the family car to drive to Hill House for this trip. And you watch the sister keep saying, Jackson's so nice about this. Eleanor keeps saying the car is half mine. It was like half my inheritance. And the sister keeps saying, I just don't know if I can let you take my car. And they just keep doing that. And then the brother-in-law just keeps saying, what if our kid gets sick while you're away? We might need to get in the car and drive somewhere. And you see her being snowed under by the weight of this family and these people who just don't listen to her. And so then one morning after they've told her no, she just steals the car. And you're actually proud of her. She's done this bold thing. And I guess in a way, reading it then when I was booted out of school, and I'm not going to say anybody's names, but I had been treated really badly by this dean when I got booted out. Literally in his office, he said to me, you will never graduate while I am a dean. And I had never met this dude before. And so it really felt like, wow, the universe is out to get me. And so maybe I was extra empathetic to Eleanor and her feelings of being crushed under the weight of these people. And so that first 25 pages, she steals the car. And then on her drive to Hill House, it's her first time that she is free. And you watch her stopping in different places and living out these fantasies about, I could just go here and I could live in the woods and I could grow this kind of fruit and vegetables and I could just live happily. Or I could go here and the beauty of it is you see her trying out independence. You see her trying to stand up for herself. And then she goes to Hill House.
Where everything goes fine.
Where it's the shortest novel ever. She gets there, everyone welcomes her, it's all sweet, the house isn't haunted.
Have you ever borrowed anything from this book for your work? A character name, a beat, a motivation, a tone? What have you pulled out of it?
Well, actually, I mean, rereading it again just over the weekend, the opening bits, I realized the beginning of Lone Women is Eleanor's escape. And the way that she's afraid of being caught, like I absolutely lifted that feeling for Adelaide. And in a way, it's not in the book because in the end, my editor and I agreed it was a little boring. But I spent actually a lot more time in an earlier draft. You stayed with her on the ship that she's first on from Southern California. Then she's in Seattle. She spends a little time in Seattle. Then from Seattle, she takes the train across Montana. And that one, I spent even more time like really borrowing from that first 25 pages in particular.
When was the last time that you read The Haunting of Hill House?
The last time before this weekend, when I was rereading it for this, my wife had given birth to our first son. It was the summer. We're both off from teaching. So we were just basically, what we would do is we were up and down by his schedule at that point and living this kind of weird nocturnal life where we would, at around 5 o'clock, watch The Wire while drinking beer and eating popcorn with this like wheat dust on top of it because it was supposedly going to give us more energy or whatever it might do. And then eventually he would fall asleep. My wife, who was absolutely much more exhausted, would crash. And one of those times I was in the kitchen. I started to make it my thing that I would be in the kitchen so that I could be closer to, if he woke up, I could get to him quicker. And I started to read some things. And this was one of the books. I actually read Haunting of Hill House then. So that would have been 11 years ago now because he's 11. And I also read the book that came after this, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is, as much as I love this book, that's her masterpiece, I would say. But the two are almost like a great pairing. But I read that exhausted in our kitchen in Washington Heights. And in that one, I just envied the idea that Eleanor lived alone. Because I really needed to live alone at that point when our baby was about a month or two old.
I remember those crazy early morning hours and being up and trying to read something I think I watched The Babadook at 4 o'clock in the morning, which is not a great movie if you've just had a kid.
That's a terrible idea.
Oh my God, maybe this was a bad idea.
Yes. That's a profound, I mean, I love that movie, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend it then.
I had not read a plot synopsis beforehand. It was my mistake. How do you recommend this book to people if you ever do? When you're trying to tell someone you absolutely have to read Haunting of Hill House, how do you sell it?
Actually, often it's with that opening paragraph that you asked me to read because I really feel like it's almost a kind of key. Like if a person hears that paragraph and they lean in, they kind of go, wait a second, what does that mean Hill House is not sane? What does that mean that even Larks and Katydids dream? If all those things inspire questions, then I know this will be your thing. Just take it. I promise you. And then if I read that to someone and they go, I don't know what they're talking about, I don't know what that means, I often say, let me think of something else. How about because the nice thing is then I might recommend the We Have Always Lived in the Castle because that one begins with a much clearer, in theory, introduction to the main character, Mary Cat. And she's super weird, but it's more concrete. But really, I say at heart, like, do you want to read a beautifully written book about a very lonely woman and a very lonely house?
Well, this is definitely a book that I can see myself reading several more times in my life. Hopefully that's the same for you.
Yes.
And hopefully for everyone listening, we've convinced you to give it a shot.
I hope so. It will reward you.
It's one of the greats.
Yes.
I've been speaking with Victor LaValle about Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House and about his new novel, Lone Women. Victor, thank you so much for being here today.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for this.
For the Book Review Podcast, I'm Gilbert Cruz. Thank you for listening.